ratified. And we're going to talk about the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. We're going to talk about the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. We're going to talk about who approved the 13th Amendment to the Constitution immediately, and which states did not, and what impact did that have on people's lives, right? So let's jump into that and let's get into that, because December 6, 1865 was when it was ratified. But, I talked a little bit last week about this man here, this gentleman, Archer Alexander. And Archer Alexander was somebody who was enslaved in Missouri in 1863. He was enslaved in Missouri for a long period of time, but in 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation, he was accused of doing something by the person who was his enslaver, and he tried to run away, and he was caught, maybe under the auspices of the fugitive slave law, but he was caught and he was going to be sold. He was somebody who was going to be sold into Kentucky. This is after the Emancipation Proclamation in February and March of 1863. And so, as you know, the several states, Missouri and Kentucky were, as well as Delaware and Maryland, they were border states that did not secede from the Union, but states that had slavery in them and supported slavery. So this whole idea of the 13th Amendment and what we should do with the 13th Amendment and whether the 13th Amendment needed to be passed was something that was a significant thing. And it made an impact in the lives of people like Archer Alexander and other people who were in states that did not outlaw slavery. So we're going to talk about this with respect to the 13th Amendment and how this might have affected people's lives, because as I've read a lot of historical accounts and, read textbooks and history books, I've heard people say that, did we really need to even pass the 13th Amendment? Did some of the things that the radicals in Congress were doing, was it even necessary to do? Did we need these amendments to the Constitution to end slavery? When we think about the lives of the people who were impacted by people who refused to end slavery, the answer is absolutely yes. And anybody's life matter. Anybody who was able to be in slavery in a legal way that was justified and sanctioned by the United States needed that type of protection and needed those type of laws in place. So when we talk about the 13th Amendment, as I mentioned, it was the December 6, 1865 when it was ratified. And so we'll talk about what is it, what did it say, and kind of jump from there. And it essentially says that slavery or involuntary servitude, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude will exist in the United States or any area subject to the United States jurisdiction unless that person has been convicted of a crime, duly convicted of a crime. So that's pretty much the 13th Amendment. And if in the second part just says the Congress shall have the ability to enforce this, by law, by articles that they will pass. And so with legislation. So, when you think about it, that's pretty much what the 13th Amendment is saying. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude will exist anywhere in the United States or any place the United States has jurisdiction over unless a person has been duly convicted of a crime. That's what it's saying. But when you go to look at the history and how it went out, the states that passed it and did not pass it, it's very interesting to look at. It's a very interesting telling in terms of what people did. So, when it was first introduced in Congress, it was 1864. It was April of 1864. And the Senate passed this as a potential amendment to the Constitution. And it should have been something very simple. It should have been something that kind of went through. It took a long time, though. It wasn't until January of the next year, 1865, that it passed the House and was then being presented to the states in order to ratify. And obviously, 3/4 of the states had to ratify it in order for it to become a part of the Constitution. So this wasn't an easy fight to simply say at a national level that anybody in the United States will not be held as a slave and involuntary servitude legally within our country. That was a fight. Just to say that those simple lines was a fight to do. So as it went forth in 1865, here's kind of a list of the states that ratified it. And at the time, it needed as many as 27. Once it had to hit the 27th state, it would become adopted as a part of the Constitution according to the constitutional rules, right? So, Illinois was the first state to adopted very soon, right after it was passed. As I mentioned, it was January 1865, actually January 31st. The very next day, February 1st, Illinois adopts it. And the state legislature in these various states have to, in a special way, adopt the amendment to the Constitution in order for it to eventually become a part of the Constitution. So as you start to read it, Rhode Island, Michigan, Maryland, you all the way down the list, many states are adopting it right away. This is toward the tail end of the Civil War. It's pretty clear that the North has the upper hand now. And the issue of slavery is front and center. So you can see the states that are adopting. And it's interesting, as you notice some states like Louisiana or Virginia or Maryland, you can start to see, even in Maryland, which was a border state, which was a state that did not secede from the Union, the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to Maryland. It did not apply to Delaware or Missouri or Kentucky. It didn't apply to places or any place in the South that was not in rebellion against the United States or was not under Union control. And there were significant places that were. So Maryland itself, had slavery after the Emancipation Proclamation. It wasn't until November 1st, 1864, that Maryland in November outlawed slavery in the state of Maryland. So, when we talk about, Juneteenth, which is very important, when we talk about people being impacted by slavery, there are people who lingered in slavery after the Emancipation Proclamation. And I think it's very important because everybody's life matters. Everybody's situation matters. What it meant to them to still be in slavery, what it meant to their children, what it meant to their children's children. To linger in slavery was a horrible thing for us to not stop. We should never have had it, but for us to not stop right away when we should have, that's a significant thing for us to have been having not done in various places. So Maryland does it at a state level in November in 1864. And then you can start to see, as you start to see places, it isn't until 1865. So Missouri is, it's also trying to pass a somewhat of a similar kind of a gradual emancipation law, but it's already keeping slavery after the Emancipation Proclamation. So it takes some time for it to end in Missouri as well. And there's more to that. We can talk about that a little bit later. But as you start to see, you can start to tell, for example, Virginia and Louisiana, which were obviously parts of the Confederacy, you can start to tell when these states became to be coming back into the Union after the Civil War, when they began to ratify certain parts of the Constitution, reorganize their government, set up their own new state constitutions. There were several things that they had to do. And so you can get an idea from when they're ratifying it, when these processes are taking in place. Unfortunately, in a lot of these places, when they did what was necessary from a congressional standpoint, initially from a presidential standpoint, and then from a congressional standpoint, to do what it took to become a part of the Union again, to be readmitted into Congress, readmitted as a state, they just reorganized their state legislatures once they got back in and kicked Black people out violently. They, in many cases, enacted laws, Jim Crow laws, separation laws, sharecropping systems, where Black people were essentially still enslaved in a situation of enslavement and indebted to the very same people who were enslaving and the very same powers that were enslaving them. But the idea of ending slavery legally was a significant thing in America and in the United States. So you can start to get to see that. As we start to go on, Tennessee is another example of it, because in Tennessee is one of the first states, I believe maybe the first state to be readmitted back into the Union. Andrew Johnson was from Tennessee. They ended up, ratifying the 13th Amendment right away. They ended up changing their constitution. They ended up doing several things that they wanted to do on their end, kind of quickly, if you will, and ended up getting back into slavery or getting back into the Union. But they also, very soon after that, reorganized their state legislature, reorganized themselves from a societal standpoint. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in Tennessee for the most part. You had all kinds of, white league and terrorist groups that were there to terrorize Black people. There were some very horrible things that took place in places like Memphis and these were times when they were supposedly being readmitted, going back into the Union and having accepted the end of slavery. So just because they accepted it didn't mean that it was a day in the sun, if you will, for Black people. Everything were peachy. But you can kind of get an idea of how things are moving forward. And as you look this, you start to see where people are accepting it. And it isn't until the 27th state to accept and to adopt and to pass within their legislature, have their state legislature adopt and pass and ratify the 13th Amendment, that the 13th Amendment becomes part of the United States Constitution. It's adopted. So that's on December 6, 1865. And that was when, at the time, the 27th state was Georgia, and that was enough to get the majority, according to the Constitution, according to the rules, to have the amendment adopted in the United States Constitution. But others went on to continue to adopt it, obviously. And so when you think about that idea of ending slavery, and we understand what was taking place in Reconstruction, that becomes a significant thing, because several states did not end up adopting the 13th Amendment. So the states that rejected the 13th Amendment, New Jersey, Delaware, Kentucky, and Mississippi, all rejected the 13th Amendment. And you might ask yourself, and we just read it like up there, it all is essentially saying is that slavery or involuntary servitude will not be a part of any part of the United States. You will not have slavery in any part of the United States or where the United States has jurisdiction of, unless a person has been duly convicted of a crime. What's wrong with that? Like, what's the problem to say that slavery is wrong and it won't be in the United States? But the state of New Jersey said no. We won't accept it. Some of the reasonings for why some of the states that rejected the 13th Amendment, they wanted compensation. Like for Mississippi, they wanted the people who were enslavers, who had people who had human traffickers and had their money invested in human beings. They wanted them to be compensated for the loss of their property. And so that was a ridiculous thing. When you think about people saying, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, or the idea of saying, welfare, or saying things about people who have entitlement, or what they want to call that. Some of these same areas that say that come from traditions where they wanted people to help them when they were in situations where they were losing other people as property. This is an idea of entitlement, and that rhetoric that goes on has been for a long time in American history, not a recent part, but a long time in American history where people have been saying that. And some of those very same areas were asking the United States of America to compensate them for people that they were losing as property. And so some of these people did not accept the 13th Amendment. The idea that slavery will not exist, they did not accept it. And they were not unequivocal about it. They were very clear. For example, in Kentucky, the state of Kentucky essentially said, we're not going to accept it from a standpoint of any rejection of slavery, any abolition of slavery, whether it's with compensation or not compensation. The state of Kentucky, the legislature in Kentucky, rejects that whole idea. So when Kentucky rejected it in February of 1865, February 24th of 1865, it said, we're not gonna stand for any abolishment of slavery. We think that the Union can exist with slavery. And so imagine if you were somebody like Archer Alexander, who was in Missouri, who had been captured after January 1st, 1863. He was captured, and he was going to be sold along with some other African-American men into Kentucky in 1863 after the Emancipation Proclamation had gone into effect. Imagine if you were in that area and you were like one of the other men. He got away, Archer Alexander got away, but some of the other men that were with him got caught and were presumably sold into Kentucky. Imagine if you were them and you were in the state of Kentucky, and it's 1865, it's 1864, and the people in Kentucky and the legislature saying, we're not going to end slavery no matter what. The idea of us saying that slavery is wrong should not have been something that even started, and it should not have been something that was difficult to end. But there was fight tooth and nails for that. People were fighting tooth and nails for that. So New Jersey ended up initially rejecting it, as I mentioned it. New Jersey rejected it, and ended up eventually ratifying it later on in 1866. So it took a whole year later for New Jersey to then ratify the 13th Amendment to say that human slavery is wrong and should not be in the United States. Texas did not ratify the 13th Amendment until 1870, so several years later. And when we think about, the famous date of June 19th, 1865, or that being Juneteenth, where, the federal government and the military came into Galveston, Texas, and made the announcement that the Emancipation Proclamation applied to areas in Texas because it had been in rebellion against the United States, and that if you were enslaved, you're now free. You should have been free, but you're now free, and you now have to be treated as a worker and not as an enslaved person. And it also mentioned something that we're not going to take, laziness or vagabondry and something like that, which they should not have mentioned, which is kind of crazy. But they mentioned that in June 19th, 1865. But slavery is not over in Kentucky. Slavery is not over in Kentucky. In the middle of June of 1865, you could have been a person, just like the people who were with Archer Alexander, even though he got away, you could have been a person in June of 1865 in Kentucky and still enslaved. It wasn't the 13th Amendment was not adopted until December, toward the end of that year of 1865. So you could have had people who were in areas like in Delaware or in Kentucky who were still enslaved until either their state legislature passed a law within their state, or until it was passed nationally. They could have been legally enslaved, and they could have had people supporting that. And that's ridiculous. It doesn't matter if the majority of people were at the time leaving slavery and being free. The fact that anybody could have been enslaved in America, even in 1865, after the Emancipation Proclamation, and whether they were border state or someplace like Texas, and even when it came in June 19th of 1865, that message was given in Galveston, which is on the eastern part of the state. It took a while for that message to get across Texas. So there were people enslaved in America in 1865 after Juneteenth, and it could have been in Kentucky, would have been in places like Texas. But so to continue talking about this, Delaware also rejected this initially. It rejected it on February 8th, 1865. It wasn't until February 12th, 1901, that the state of Delaware ratified the 13th Amendment. I'm not kidding, guys. Look it up. It wasn't until 1901 that the state of Delaware ratified the 13th Amendment and said, as a state, slavery within the United States is wrong. Let's just officially say this is Delaware, 1901. It wasn't until then that they ratified it. And then, with respect to the other places that had rejected the 13th Amendment, so Kentucky, as I mentioned, rejected it on February 24th, 1865, saying, we're not going to sign on to the idea that slavery should not exist in any form, whether you're being compensated for your loss of property or not being compensated. We don't agree with it. That's what they said literally. You can look it up. That's what they said literally in February of 1865. It wasn't until March of 1976. March of 1976, a bicentennial year, that the state of Kentucky, the state legislature of Kentucky, said that they would sign on to the 13th Amendment. Obviously, slavery was already illegal in the United States. It was already illegal, it was already part of the Constitution, but it wasn't until 1976 that the state of Kentucky signed on to the 13th Amendment, which is ridiculous and incredible to me. And then, but that's not even it. Mississippi, which originally also rejected the 13th Amendment, in December 4th, 1865, so kind of an anniversary of that, on December 4th, 1865, they did not ratify the 13th Amendment until March of 1995. Just breathe on that for a second. 1995. And the interesting thing about it, if you look this up, because you can look it up, there are articles about this. You look up articles and you'll find articles from 2013 a lot that will talk about how the state legislature, when they ratified the 13th Amendment in 1995, some type of mishap or oversight took place before they actually submitted it to the Archivist of the United States for it to be officially registered that the state had ratified the 13th Amendment. So it wasn't recognized because they had a mishap and forgot to turn in the paper to the United States government to say, hey, we officially do this. So it wasn't recognized until 2013, but they ratified it in 1995. I don't care about if there was a mishap, even though that kind of sounds ridiculous. It would take you years to actually submit it when you ratify something from the Constitution, as important as the 13th Amendment. But why did it take you 130 years, over 100 years, from 1865 to 1995 to ratify it in the first place? Why did it take you that long to say something as significant as human slavery in the United States is wrong, and we're going to go on record supporting the 13th Amendment? So I wanted to share that, guys. If you have any questions or comments, please put this down. But I think we should share that. That becomes a significant part of the experience that we're having in America, and the experience that many people have to go through with respect to slavery and the legacy of it and how we talk about it. So please share this with somebody. God bless you, and thank you so much for listening.